Oye, vivir contigo no ha sido fácil. Las personas me miran, pero te recuerdan a ti. Y ahora con lo que está pasando será peor que nunca.
¿No tiene que serlo?
¡Seguro que sí!
Porque tú tienes tu vida, hijo.
¿Con mi apellido? Por eso tengo un buen empleo, papá. Por eso las personas me hablan en primer lugar. Y ahora estaba saliendo adelante. Comenzaba a lograr algo por mí mismo. Y pasa esto. Te lo estoy pidiendo como un favor. No sigas con esto, ¿sí? Porque terminará mal para ti y terminará mal para mí.
¿Sientes que te hago daño?
Sí, en cierto modo.
Eso es lo único que no quería hacer.
Sé que no querías hacerlo, pero esa es la realidad. ¿No te importa lo que piensen de ti? ¿No te molesta que las personas te tomen a broma y que a mí me incluirán en eso? ¿Crees que es correcto? ¡Di algo!
No vas a creer esto. Pero cabías aquí. Te levantaba y le decía a tu madre, este niño va a ser el mejor hijo del mundo. Este niño será mejor que cualquier persona del mundo. Y creciste siendo maravilloso. Era genial verte todos los días, era un privilegio. Cuando llegó el momento de que fueras un hombre y enfrentar al mundo, lo hiciste. Pero en algún momento cambiaste. Dejaste de ser tú. Dejaste que las personas te señalaran y dijeran que no eras útil. Y cuando se volvió duro, empezaste a buscar a quién culpar, como a una sombra. Te diré algo que ya sabes. El mundo no es un arcoíris y nubes rosas. Es un mundo malo y muy salvaje. Y no importa qué tan rudo seas, te pondrá de rodillas y te dejará así permanentemente si lo dejas. Ni tú, ni yo, ni nadie golpeará tan duro como la vida. Pero no importa qué tan duro lo hagas. Importa lo duro que resistas y sigas avanzando. ¿Cuánto resistirás y seguirás avanzando? Así es como se gana. Y si sabes cuánto vales, sal a buscar lo que mereces, pero debes ir dispuesto a que te den golpes y no a culpar a otros y decir, no soy lo que quiero ser por él, por ella o por nadie. Los cobardes lo hacen y tú no lo eres. Tú eres mejor, hijo. Siempre te amaré sin importar nada. Sin importar lo que pase. Eres mi hijo y mi familia. Eres lo mejor de mi vida. Pero hasta que empieces a tener fe en ti, no tendrás una vida. No olvides visitar a tu madre.
Mornings. I shut everything down. No. I'm sorry. I made a mistake here. Is it the same? Conductism and behaviorism? Probably.
What is structuralism? What?
Today, I want to talk to you about 7 things that native English speakers
So
don't
for the
really
last-
say and what you should.
Thought Leadership podcast, Dr. Nick Saville discusses the Common European Framework of Reference, or CEFR.
Dr. Nick Saville, thanks for talking to the Cambridge English podcast series today about the CEFR, or the Common European Framework of Reference. Why do we need a CEFR, or a Common Framework of Reference?
Well, for a number of reasons, but think about it this way. We need a way of talking about educational matters to do with language learning in a way which can be shared amongst a range of participants in education. So what do we mean by participants? Well, learners, teachers, parents, employers, and of course, assessment providers. A common language, in other words, metaphorically speaking, to help us set goals and measure progress. To this. what to teach and how to teach it. And I think at the heart of a framework of this kind is the idea of a learning ladder, a way of measuring progression from a beginner to an intermediate level to an advanced level. Well, there's the problem in a sense. What do I mean by intermediate level? An intermediate level in Spain could mean something very different than an intermediate level in China. So what the framework provides at its core is a series of levels, A1, A2, B1, B2, C1, C2, those 6 now very well-known levels, which allow us to define in more detail, with more precision, what we mean by progression.
But basically, it's a common language so that wherever you go in the world, people can speak this language and presumably relate to one another.
Yes.
Regardless of the language they're speaking, that they know what one another are talking about.
Yes, so it provides a way of speaking about the things that matter. I just indicated that, a term like intermediate could mean many things to many people. What we've done in applying the framework is to provide people with a toolkit, if you like, of understanding things better. So focusing on what needs to be learned, finding ways to talk about that in ways which are understandable to that wider range of participants. So not just technical language, but language which teachers and students can share together. We often refer to this as a can-do approach. What do you need to be able to do if you're going to become a doctor? What do you need to be able to do if you're going to become a shop assistant and you're going to use a foreign language? That's an important point. The framework itself is not related to any one language. So it provides a very broad way of thinking. So whether you're learning French or Spanish, Chinese or Japanese, it provides a uniting framework. Cambridge English are applying it to English, and talking to people who are speakers of many other languages is their first languages. And so they may come from different traditions or different backgrounds. So again, the common language, if you like to call it that, as you did before, provides a way of understanding better the nature of language learning and what represents progression.
So it must be common tool in use throughout what we call this
way of undergrounds. So again, the common language, if you like to call it that, as you did before, provides a way of understanding better the nature of language learning. Provides a way of understanding better the nature of language learning and what represents progression.
So it must be a common tool in use throughout what we call this globalized world. It's something that people can recognize, they can understand it, and they can work to it, to this framework.
Yes, that's right.
It is a tool.
It's a tool, really. I mean, it's a framework. That's an important word, and it's a framework of reference. So it doesn't provide you with all the answers. It provides you a way of coming up with the answers, a way of addressing what needs to be done. So whether it's in Chile or China or many parts in between, you'll find the common framework of reference being used. And in fact, although it originated in Europe and it has its origins in projects which date back to the 1960s even, nowadays, 2014, it's being used quite easily in every part of the world because it's very useful.
And also, I presume you've got technology which can spread concepts like this very fast throughout the world through the use of the internet, the computer, and other things. If people are using this tool or framework, are there do's and don'ts? I presume do they need training?
Basically, yes, if you want to use it in a technical way. So if you want to use it, as we do, for assessment purposes, it's not adequate. It provides a starting point, but you need to know a lot about assessment. And you need to know a lot more about how you define the things you're going to test, how you measure progression with statistical support and so on. But at one level, it can be reduced to a tool for just talking about what it is that needs to be learned in ways which are in everyday parlance. And actually, the can-do model, which is defining learning goals in what needs to be learned in order to be able to do them in a realistic setting, has been implemented in a range of quite simple tools which are not technical at all. So the European language portfolio, which came along at the same time, was designed to take the concepts of the framework and provide teachers and learners with a way of using them in classroom contexts. So in answer to your question, yes and no. I mean, if you're going to be very technical, yes, I think you do need to learn the technical dimensions related to it. But if you're going to be in a layman context, I think the framework provides quite useful tools.
What about philosophy that underpins it and the principles for people to work to? What are these? You said it sort of goes back a number of years now, but are you revising that philosophy and the principles?
I think that those principles continue to evolve, but it stems back to perhaps the 1970s as the main starting point, which saw language teaching moving from grammar and translation approaches to approaches which focus mainly on communication skills. So seeing the outcome of learning as a realistic way of communicating through another language rather than knowing a lot about a language. We called that in those days the communicative approach. At the heart of the common framework is a communicative approach to language teaching, learning and assessment. The framework itself talks about an action-oriented approach, that is to create learning which leads to action, so to be able to do things, to go to the railway station and buy your ticket, or to be able, at a higher level to write a report in a legal office. Different level of proficiency, but they are real-world tasks that have to be performed as a result of having learnt the language, and in many cases, if you want to do that latter task, it's having persisted in doing it for many years, so that your progression has been cumulative, perhaps throughout your schooling, but also taken forward into the workplace.
Am I right to call it outcome-oriented?
Yes, I think so. That's what we're looking for. Outcomes in the sense of a real ability to communicate. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, we don't expect every learner to reach a level very similar to a native speaker. A, because not everyone's capable of that, and B, because the context of learning and the number of hours and the amount of time spent will not facilitate that. But what we do believe is that the framework levels, that A1, to C2 way of thinking about progression in themselves can be useful outcomes. So an A1 proficiency is very limited in some ways, but it can actually enable you to do things. If you can tick off the things you can do, then you can build on that with an A2 level or a B1 level. And for many people, the level they've reached through schooling or perhaps even in self-taught learning can enhance their life by adding that useful skill, which can be recognized for being useful, even though in some cases quite limited. And it also therefore scaffolds further learning. So if you can be encouraging about progress, so to give recognition for those stages of learning, it potentially helps people persist and continue up what I referred to as a ladder, a way of going forward.
And I believe there's a concertinaed approach, or you can expand it so that teachers and learners can set more specific, smaller targets appropriate to their abilities.
That's a very important dimension of the framework. It's not a fixed framework. The levels are reference levels, but they need to be implemented within learning programs. I refer to curricular and syllabus issues. So that is, how do you implement a learning program in a local context? Well, potentially you need to specify much smaller baby steps, if you like, which need to be gone through in order to reach one of those levels. They're quite big chunks of learning. So if you imagine expanding the A1, A2 levels, you might turn it into 6 or 9 stages of learning, which you have to sort of progress through in order to get to one of these key stages, the A1 or the A2. So you could adapt the framework to learning context in Japan, for example. In fact, that's what's happened. The Japanese educationists over there have produced something which they call the CFRJ, or I think they call it the KEFA-J, which is a way of taking the basic principles of the framework, the can-do approach, the action-oriented model I mentioned, and the basic level system, and have expanded it with additional information and different additional can-do statements to suit the step-by-step progression needed in Japanese grade schools. So, from kindergarten perhaps to school leaving, breaking it down into ways in which it might fit within educational processes in Japan.
You must be proud of that flexibility. And within that, you also speak of a horizontal dimension, as two learners at the same CEFR level may differ greatly in their strengths and needs.
I think that's true. I mean, if you see progression as a vertical concept, like going up a ladder, one thing that you know is that if you put a group of 30 people in a room who are all 14, they may have many similarities. Say they're all Italian school children, but they will all have differences in their ability to learn the language. And also, by the time they reach 14, they would have acquired more or less proficiency through their previous learning. What I think the horizontal dimension allows you to do is to think about the individualization of learning. If you're all at A2 level, more or less, how far up the ladder are you, and where do you have strengths and weaknesses? So I think the challenge for the future is to individualize learning more and to use the concept of individual pathways, adaptivity in learning, and ways of building on strengths and weaknesses, say in the skill base, whether reading or listening or speaking, whatever it might be, in order to help learners make their own progression. But at some point you have to bring it back to sort of a common understanding of whether that progression has worked. So an employer, a parent even, might want to say, well, so you've finished your year at school. How much progress have you made? Have you reached the outcome that we expected, or do you still need more help in order to get there? So hence the common framework, reading or listening. Yeah. is to individualize learning more and to use the concept of individual pathways, adaptivity in learning, and ways of building on strengths and weaknesses, say, in the skill base, whether reading or listening or speaking, whatever it might be, in order to help learners make their own progression. But at some point, you have to bring it back to a common understanding of whether that progression has worked. So an employer, a parent even, might want to say, well, so you've finished your year at school. How much progress have you made? Have you reached the outcome that we expected, or do you still need more help in order to get there? Hence the common framework concept.
So the CEFR finally, work in progress, but a solid standard within this common European framework of reference that teachers, students, employers can rely on. It's trusted, it's reliable, it's rigorous.
The framework itself requires the users to build in the rigorousness, the reliability, and so on, and to adapt it to their context in ways which is useful. But the basis for that is provided by the framework, and people who employ it to underpin their work, like we do in Cambridge English, then provide the added value, the tools which give the other participants, the parents, the teachers, the learners, the employers, the things they need to make it work for them.
You must be very proud of it.
Well, I'm personally proud of the work we've done with it. I actually have to give the praise to those who have developed it over many, many years. And so we're standing on the shoulders of other giants in that case.
Dr. Nick Saville, thanks for talking to the Cambridge English podcast series.
Personally proud of the work we've done with it. I give is provided by the framework, and people who employ it to underpin their work, like we do in Cambridge English, then provide the added value, the tools which give the other participants, the parents, the teachers, the learners, the employers, the things they need to make it work for them.
You must be very proud of it.
Well, I'm personally proud of the work we've done with it. I actually have to give the praise to those who have developed it over many, many years. And so we're standing on the shoulders of other giants in that case.
Dr. Nick Saville, thanks for talking to the Cambridge English podcast series today about the common European framework of reference, what you call the CEFR. I've learned so much.
Thank you very much. Been a pleasure.
This is a research and thought leadership podcast from Cambridge English Language Assessment. For more information, please visit our website www.cambridgeenglish.org.
Piaget's theory argues that we have to conquer 4 stages of cognitive development. First, the sensory motor stage. Second, the pre-operational stage. Third, the concrete operational stage. And fourth, the formal operational stage. Only once we have gone through all the stages, at what age can vary, we are able to reach full human intelligence. 1. The sensory motor stage, ages birth to 2. In the sensory motor stage, we develop through experiences and movement our 5 senses. Our brain wants to see, hear, smell, taste and touch as much as possible. First, we start with simple reflexes, and soon after we develop habits. From 4 months old, we become aware of things beyond our own body, and then as we get older, we learn to do things intentionally. A key milestone is the development of working memory, or in Piaget terms, our realization of object permanence. Before that, our mum can show and to exist, even when we can't see them. We start becoming curious about everything. We want to smell flowers, taste food, listen to sounds, and talk to strangers. To explore more, we move. We learn to sit, crawl, stand, walk, and even to run. This increased physical mobility consequently leads to increased cognitive development. But we remain egocentric, meaning we can perceive the world only from our own point of view. 2. The pre-operational stage, ages 2 to 7. Our thinking is mainly categorized through symbolic functions and intuitive thoughts. We have lots of fantasies and believe objects are alive. As we are not able to apply specific cognitive operations, Piaget calls this stage pre-operational. We learn to speak and understand that words, images and gestures are symbols for something else. When we draw our family, we are not concerned about drawing each person to scale, but rather with their symbolic meanings. We love to play pretend, which allows us to experience something new and learn a lot. At around age 4, most of us become very curious and ask many questions. We want to know everything. We can call it the birth of primitive reasoning. Piaget calls it the intuitive age, because while we realize that we have a vast amount of knowledge, we have no idea how we acquired it. Our thinking in this stage is still pretty egocentric. We think others see the world like we do, and still don't understand that they see it differently. 3. The concrete operational stage, ages 7 to 11. We finally discover logic, and we develop concrete cognitive operations, such as sorting objects in a certain order. One example of this is inductive reasoning, which means that if we see someone eating a cookie, we can draw a conclusion and then make a generalization. And we now get the concept of conservation. We understand that if we pour orange juice from a normal glass to a taller one, the amount stays the same. Our younger sister will pick the taller glass, thinking she gets more. By the same logic, we only now can understand that if 3 plus 5 equals 8, then 8 minus 3 must equal 5. Our brain learns to rearrange our thoughts, to classify and build concrete operational mental structures. For example, we now know that we can reverse an action by doing the opposite. Excited by our new mental abilities, we apply them in conversations, activities, when we learn to write, and in school. As a result, we get to know ourselves better. We begin to understand that our thoughts and feelings are unique and not necessarily those of others. That means that we learn to put ourselves in someone else's shoes. 4. The formal operational stage, age 12 plus. Once we become teenagers, we become formally operational. We now have the ability to think more rationally about abstract concepts and hypothetical events. Our advanced cognitive abilities allow us to understand abstract concepts such as success and failure, love and hate. We form a deeper understanding of our own identity and our morality. We now also think that we understand why people behave the that the formal operational stage is the final stage of our cognitive development. Jean Piaget's first interests were animals, and he published his first scientific paper on albino sparrows in 1907, when he was just 11 years old. In 1920, he began working with standardized intelligence tests. He realized that younger children consistently make types of mistakes that older children do not. He concluded that they must think differently, and spent the rest of his life studying the intellectual development of children.
Let's talk about behaviorism. We begin in late 19th century Russia, where scientist Ivan Pavlov lived with his dogs. Whenever Pavlov would bring the dogs their food, they would salivate. One day, he walked into the room without food and was shocked to see that the dogs were still drooling in anticipation. What Pavlov had accidentally discovered was the concept of classical conditioning. He didn't have to do anything to make those dogs drool when they saw food, but Pavlov wondered if he did something to make the dogs think they were getting food, could he make them drool whenever he wanted to? And that's just what he did. Pavlov first identified the stimulus, the thing that caused the dog's response or behavior. In this case, the stimulus was the food because it caused the dogs to salivate. Then he paired the stimulus with a separate incident, the sound of a bell. Every time Pavlov brought the dogs food, he rang a bell. Once the dogs got used to the sound of the bell at feeding time, Pavlov tried ringing the bell without giving the dogs any food. And voila, the dogs started drooling anyway. Pavlov had successfully trained the dogs to react to the new stimulus, the ringing of the bell, the same way that they reacted to food. Classical conditioning is a learning process that inspired behaviorism. By taking an unconditioned stimulus, the food that naturally caused the dogs to salivate, and combining with something entirely neutral, the bell, he was able to remove the first stimulus and make something that was formerly neutral elicit the conditioned response. But we'll talk about that later.
John B. Watson, an American psychologist, was intrigued by Pavlov's studies. He, along with many other behavioralists in the 20th century, believed that psychology should be a science, that is, based on facts and examined evidence. He believed that human development could only be based on what one could see. Watson was famous for saying he could take any child and turn him into anyone he wanted, just by changing the child's environment. A musician, a lawyer, a businessman, a doctor, even a thief or a beggar. John Watson was most famous for his work with the 11-month-old infant named Little Albert. Although his methods would be highly unethical today, Watson made great strides in the field of behavioralism and classical conditioning. For example, Watson conditioned Little Albert to have a fear of rats, using a very similar method to the one used by Pavlov. Every time Little Albert was presented with a white rat, Watson made loud noises and startled the child and made him cry. After a while, all Watson had to do was bring the rat near Little Albert and the baby would scream and cry. In this experiment, the loud noises were considered the unconditioned stimulus. Little Albert didn't need to learn to be afraid of loud noises, just like the dogs in Pavlov's experiment didn't need to be taught to drool at the sight of food. These things provoke certain responses naturally. Therefore, Little Albert crying serves as the unconditioned response. Crying or screaming is a baby's natural response to loud noises. Likewise, drooling is a natural response for dogs that smell good food. Once Little Albert began to associate the neutral rat with the negative, loud noise, the rat became the conditioned stimulus. That is, the previously neutral object that now elicits a response. In Pavlov's experiment, this was the bell that eventually made the dogs drool. And that makes Little Albert's fear of the rats the conditioned response. Even though he wasn't afraid of rats at first, he eventually learned by associating rats with loud noises that upset him. B.F. Skinner, an American scientist born in 1904, took classical conditioning just one step further. Skinner is often called the father of operant conditioning, and he was most famous for conducting experiments with animals in his Skinner box. Like Watson, Skinner believed that psychology should be studied through a more objective lens, and that required hard evidence, observation, and experimentation. Operant conditioning is similar to classical conditioning, but by no means are the two the same. You see, operant conditioning involves changing one's behavior by use of reinforcement or punishment, which is given after a desired response. The behaviors that change in operant conditioning are voluntary. The behaviors operate on the environment to produce an outcome. It focuses on motivation, which is when someone or something has a strong reason to do something. Classical conditioning changes only the timing of the voluntary response.
Created using Powtoon.
I have to leave in 10 minutes, so that's all for today. I didn't finish my homework actually, but I don't know, it is what it is. Wish me luck